It is 4:17 in the morning on a Tuesday in early autumn. Somewhere over Alaska, a radar blip appears. Within minutes, interceptor missiles are in the air. Emergency alerts light up 300 million phones across the United States. The television anchors are already blinking under studio lights, scrambling to tell you what is happening. But here is what none of them will tell you. By the time that first alert buzzes on your nightstand, the real war is already 6 decades old. We think World War III begins with missiles. We think it begins with a radar signature over the Arctic, with fighter jets and naval clashes, and a president in a bunker. That is what we have been conditioned to imagine. That is the Hollywood version. The truth is colder, harder, more suffocating. World War III does not begin with a weapon. It begins with a balance sheet. It begins the moment two nuclear powers are so financially entangled and so financially desperate that neither can afford to back down. The first 6 hours of that war are not 6 hours of military action. They are 6 hours of a ledger finally snapping under the weight of decades of debt, dependency, and financial sabotage. You are watching missiles. You should be watching accountants. History is not written by generals. It is written by the men who pay them. And in the first 6 hours of the next World War, the most important document will not be a declaration of war. It will be a foreclosure notice on the global financial order that held the peace for 80 years. Let me show you what that looks like. To understand the first 6 hours, you have to understand the empire that made them possible. After 1945, the United States did not just win a war. It inherited a planet. In July of 1944, 44 nations gathered at a hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The world was still on fire. And yet, inside that hotel, men in suits were already drafting the financial architecture of the next century. The deal was elegant in its brutality. The U.S. dollar would be the world's reserve currency. Every other nation would peg its money to the dollar. The dollar itself would be pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. America held 2/3 of the world's gold reserves. It was the sun, and every other economy was a planet orbiting it. Think about the scale of that. America was not just the strongest military force on Earth. It was the bank vault of human civilization. The Marshall Plan poured $13.3 billion into rebuilding a shattered Europe between 1948 and 1952. That is roughly $140 billion in today's money. This was not charity. It was investment. Rebuilt European markets would buy American steel, American machines, American grain. The Marshall Plan was not generosity. It was a customer acquisition strategy written in the language of benevolence. For 25 years, the system worked. American factories hummed, the dollar was king, and the world paid its debts in U.S. currency. But beneath the surface, the foundation was already rotting. The first crack appeared quietly on August 15, 1971. President Nixon walked into the Oval Office, faced a camera, and in 4 minutes dissolved the Bretton Woods Agreement without consulting a single foreign government. America unilaterally ended the dollar's convertibility to gold. The window slammed shut. Just like that, the currency underpinning the global financial system became, in technical terms, nothing but printed paper backed by faith and force. It was a theft, slow, legal, and world-changing. What replaced gold was something more intoxicating: oil. By 1974, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger had negotiated a deal with Saudi Arabia that would define the next 50 years of geopolitics. Saudi Arabia would price its oil exclusively in U.S. dollars. In exchange, America would provide military protection and weapons. The petrodollar system was born. Every nation on earth that needed oil, and every nation on earth needed oil, now needed dollars first. The dollar's value was no longer backed by a medal buried in Fort Knox. It was backed by the global need for energy. America had essentially made oil the new gold, and it controlled the pump. This was not economic policy. This was addiction engineering. The world became hooked on the dollar, and America, for its part, became hooked on the privilege of printing the world's reserve currency, spending beyond its means with consequences that would be paid by future generations. By 2008, the U.S. national debt crossed $10 trillion for the first time. By 2020, it was $27 trillion. By the time the first W3 alert buzzes your phone, that number has swollen past $36 trillion. The interest payments alone now consume more than $1 trillion per year, more than the entire U.S. defense budget in the early 2000s. Let that number sink in. And the United States is not alone in its addiction. The entire Western financial system is built on a foundation of debt. Japan's national debt is 260% of its GDP. The European Central Bank has kept borrowing costs artificially suppressed for 15 years. Global debt, public and private combined, sits at over $300 trillion, roughly 3 times the size of the entire global economy. Now meet the antagonist. Not a general, not a dictator, a creditor. For decades, China has been America's banker. At its peak in 2013, China held $1.317 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds. This was not an investment. It was a leash. Every month that China continued buying American debt, it was lending oxygen to an economy that had stopped being able to breathe on its own. And every month that it kept doing so, it grew more powerful, building its own infrastructure, its own military, its own financial networks, using the very interest payments America sent to Beijing. This is the economic trap. This is the monster that grew fat in the dark. The arrangement worked as long as both parties needed each other. China needed American consumers to buy its manufactured goods. America needed Chinese capital to fund its government spending. A marriage of mutual dependency, smiling at press conferences while each partner quietly planned for divorce. The divorce papers began circulating in 2022. When Western nations froze $300 billion of Russia's foreign reserves after the invasion of Ukraine, something changed in every financial ministry from Beijing to Riyadh. The message was unmistakable. The rules of the global financial order could be rewritten overnight. Reserves you spent decades accumulating could vanish in a weekend. The dollar was not just a currency. It was a weapon, and every nation that had been accumulating dollars suddenly understood they were holding someone else's ammunition. China's response was immediate and methodical. Between 2022 and 2025, China reduced its U.S. Treasury holdings from roughly $870 billion to below $760 billion, the lowest level in 15 years. Russia abandoned the dollar in 98% of its trade with China. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the UAE began meeting quarterly to discuss an alternative reserve currency. In 2024, BRICS nations represented over 35% of global GDP at purchasing power parity, surpassing the G7 for the first time in history. The financial siege was underway, not with bombs. With bonds, here is the descent. Watch it closely, because this is where the first 6 hours become inevitable. By the mid-2020s, global energy markets were fracturing along geopolitical fault lines. Russia was selling oil to China in yuan. Saudi Arabia was pricing a portion of its exports in currencies other than the dollar for the first time since 1974. The petrodollar system, the very scaffolding of American financial dominance, was experiencing its first genuine structural stress in 50 years. Meanwhile, NATO members were hemorrhaging cash. The 2% GDP defense spending commitment, long ignored by European members, suddenly became existential. Germany, which had spent barely 1.5% of GDP on defense for a decade, scrambled to rearm. By 2025, European defense spending had jumped by over $120 billion collectively in 3 years. This was not strength. This was panic spending on credit cards already close to their limit. And the real killer, energy dependency. Europe had spent 15 years building natural gas infrastructure around Russian supply. In 2021, Russia supplied roughly 45% of Europe's natural gas. When sanctions hit after 2022, Europe scrambled to replace that supply. LNG from America, pipeline redirections, renewables built at emergency speed. The costs were staggering, an estimated 800 billion euros in additional energy transition costs over a decade. According to estimates from the European Commission, Europe was not just cold, it was bankrupt cold. Now we reach the smoking gun, the document, the meeting. The moment the foreclosure notice was signed. It is not a secret treaty. It has no dramatic title. It is an internal memo circulated at a closed meeting of the Bank for International Settlements in Basel in the spring of 2 years before the first alert. The BIS, the Central Bank of Central Banks, the institution that most people have never heard of, hosts representatives of every major reserve bank on Earth. And in that meeting, according to accounts that would only surface years later, the Chinese delegation placed a single document on the table. The document detailed what would happen to U.S. Treasury yields if China liquidated its remaining $760 billion in holdings over a period of 90 days. The modeling was clinical. U.S. 10-year Treasury yields would spike past 8%. Mortgage rates in America would climb past 12%. The cost of servicing the $36 trillion national debt would become mathematically unsustainable within 18 months. The Chinese delegation did not threaten this. They simply shared the analysis. They called it a stress scenario for global financial stability. The room understood exactly what it meant. It meant, we hold the knife. We are merely showing you its edge. One attendee, speaking anonymously much later, described the moment this way. It was not negotiation. It was not diplomacy. It was evaluation of what American sovereignty was actually worth on the open market, and the number was uncomfortable. This is the foreclosure notice. Sovereignty is solvency. When your creditor is your enemy, your independence is conditional. By the time the first radar blip appears over Alaska, 3 financial weapons have already been deployed. Swift access for multiple adversary nations has been restricted, cutting them off from the dollar clearing system that moves $5 trillion in transactions every single day. Targeted sanctions have frozen an estimated $450 billion in sovereign reserves held by adversary nations across Western financial institutions, and the adversary coalition has responded by accelerating settlements in alternative currencies, reducing their collective exposure to the dollar by an estimated 22% over 36 months. The financial war has been running for years. Most people thought it was just economics. Now watch what happens to that balance sheet in the first 6 hours. At 4:17 in the morning, the alert goes out. By 4:19, something no anchor is reporting begins. Asian markets are open. Tokyo, Shanghai, Hong Kong, Singapore, the Nikkei, 225 drops, 4.3% in 11 minutes. The Shanghai Composite loses 6.1% before circuit breakers halt trading. The Hang Seng Index falls 7% before regulators intervene. In Singapore, currency traders are already dumping the Australian dollar, the Korean won, and every other regional currency seen as exposed to Pacific conflict. By 4:31 in the morning, currency swaps between the Federal Reserve and allied central banks, the emergency lines that kept the 2008 financial system from total cardiac arrest, are being activated. The Bank of Japan, the Bank of England, the European Central Bank. Each phone call is a quiet acknowledgement that the financial system is already entering emergency medicine. The gold price sitting at $2,890 per ounce before the alert jumps to $3,200 in 40 minutes. This is not greed. This is terror. Gold is what people run to when they no longer trust the paper. But the real catastrophe begins at 5:47 in the morning in the bond market. This is where the killing happens quietly, in numbers that look like spreadsheet data, but represent the life savings of millions of people and the operational budgets of governments. The U.S. 10-year Treasury yield jumps 68 basis points in a single hour. That does not sound dramatic. It is catastrophic. A 68 basis point move in a single hour in the world's most liquid debt market is the financial equivalent of a nuclear detonation. Every mortgage in America reprices. Every corporate debt refinancing becomes more expensive. The U.S. government's daily borrowing cost, it borrows roughly $6 billion per day to operate, spikes by nearly $408 million in a single hour. The gold was moving. The credit was tightening. And the adversary knew exactly what was happening. Because at 6:13 in the morning, a decision is made in Beijing that most Western news outlets will not report for 3 days. China's State Administration of Foreign Exchange issues an internal directive. Reduce U.S. Treasury exposure by $40 billion within 72 hours. It is not a full liquidation. It is a signal, a quiet, devastating signal sold into a market already bleeding, pushing yields higher still. By 7 o'clock in the morning, the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury is on a call with the Federal Reserve Chairman. The conversation is about one thing: yield curve control. Do they intervene in the bond market to suppress yields, essentially printing money to buy their own debt, or do they let the market find its own floor? There's no good option. Yield curve control means printing money, which means inflation, which means the dollar loses value. Allowing market discovery means yields could spiral, the debt becomes unpayable, and the government itself faces a liquidity crisis. This is the impossible corner that 30 years of debt accumulation has backed America into. Military crisis and financial crisis arriving simultaneously, each one feeding the other. The generals want aircraft carriers. The Treasury needs bond buyers. Both are running out of time. At 8:15 in the morning, 3 American states with major military contractor facilities minus Virginia, Texas, and Connecticut see their municipal bond spreads widen sharply. The market is pricing in disruption to defense contract payments. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, General Dynamics, their stock prices are already down between 8% and 14% in pre-market trading, not because anyone expects them to lose business, but because the credit markets are repricing the cost of funding a war that America was already borrowing to prepare for in peacetime. By 9 o'clock in the morning, SWIFT transaction volumes have dropped 31% from their prior day average. International banks are pausing dollar clearing. Counterparty risk in the interbank lending market, the overnight plumbing of the global financial system, has frozen. Banks do not know what their counterparts in adversary nations will do, so they stop lending to each other. Credit dries up like a river in August. Overnight, the financial oxygen that keeps every business, every payroll, every supply chain functioning begins to thin. This is the social consequence that nobody explains. Bread, heat, fuel. Add heat, fuel. Add heat, fuel. Within the first 6 hours of the alerts, commodity futures markets reprice every critical import. Wheat futures spike 18% because Ukraine and Russia together supply 28% of global wheat exports. Crude oil breaks above $130 per barrel because 3 of the world's top 5 producers are either adversaries or in unstable regions. Natural gas futures in Europe rise 40% overnight. The cost of heating a home, filling a tank, buying a loaf of bread, all of it is being decided right now at 10 o'clock in the morning by algorithms in commodity pits that have nothing to do with missiles and everything to do with who controls the resources. Sovereignty is solvency. When you cannot buy what you need, you cannot defend what you have, and the aftermath will last generations. Look at what war debt does to a civilization. Britain borrowed to fight the Napoleonic Wars from 1793 to 1815, running debts that consumed over 250% of its GDP at peak. It did not make the final payment on those war bonds until February of 2015. 200 years of debt service. 2 centuries of taxation for a war fought before the Industrial Revolution. The United States spent $4.1 trillion on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, according to the Watson Institute's Cost of War project. When you include long-term veteran care and interest on the debt used to fund those wars, the total cost will exceed $8 trillion by 2050 for 2 wars that ended without clear victory. Think about what a war against a nuclear peer would cost. Not in lives first, in dollars, in decades.